Afternoon, Senator Claxton, Representative Meyer, and honorable members of the committee. I am Sharon. I live and work in Hollowell, where I'm senior attorney for the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. IATP works to support policies that promote sustainable agriculture. Unfortunately, PFAS contamination has hit farmers hard, devastating 2 Maine farms and polluting the wells of neighboring properties, as you have heard today. We support LD 164 to immediately establish an enforceable 20 parts per trillion MCL for a group of 6 PFAS chemicals. As you have heard, most of the other states adopting PFAS standards of the last 2 years have done so well below the 70 part per trillion health advisory of the EPA, which is unenforceable and too high. A lot has been said already about the health impacts of PFAS. What I wanted to specifically mention for you is something that I've put a lot of information in my written testimony about. I had some help from a Colby College student in doing that. And that is that there's current research that's found a strong association between PFAS exposure and COVID-19 severity, antibody response, and asthma. As detailed in that testimony, autopsy of people who have died with COVID-19 have found substantial accumulation of one of the PFASs, is PFBA, which unfortunately isn't part of this bill, suggesting that PFAS increases lung damage from COVID-19. And there's other studies that have associated elevated PFAS with lower antibody responses to vaccinations in children and adults. The Maine CDC amendment to LD 129 to adopt the 20 parts per trillion standard, but only for 2 PFAS, which are actually no longer manufactured, is a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. Unfortunately, drinking water contamination in Maine is not limited to those 2 PFAS. And the damaging of health effects of PFAS are also not limited to just those 2 chemicals, as I've pointed out in terms of the COVID link. In my written testimony, I linked to DEP data for the dozens of drinking water wells in Fairfield, Benton, and Unity Township that have been contaminated. You will see if you click on that, it's an interactive link, which is quite useful, that the contamination is not limited to those 2 PFAS chemicals. And interestingly, DEP is already calculating the sum of 5, in this case, chemicals. That approach that LD 164 would put into law. I do want to mention we do support the reporting, monitoring, treatment, and enforcement provisions of LD 129. And essentially, these 2 bills should be merged. The legislature should enact the 20 parts per trillion sum of 6 PFAS standard and 164, along with the language of LD 129 that includes testing and other requirements. The bottom line is, do not wait to enact these standards and look to the current medical and scientific consensus on what the standard should be. As DEP's Dave Burns stated yesterday in the PFAS briefing, without an enforceable standard, the state's hands are tied. They can't go after the US Department of Defense to clean up without a standard, for example. And that was something he mentioned yesterday at that briefing. I sat through many months of the governor's PFAS task force and learned that without enforceable standards and a requirement to test, some water systems actually refused state testing paid for by the state to find out if their systems were contaminated with PFAS. I was shocked to discover that this refusal to test included some schools and daycares. Until there is a standard in law and a requirement to comply with it, we are gambling with the health of our children and the rest of us in the midst of a deadly pandemic. We urge the committee to favorably report out LD 164, along with the monitoring and enforcement provisions. While it makes sense to phase in those latter provisions, the text should be clarified to assure that the 20 parts per trillion MCL standard itself goes into effect as soon as possible when the legislation becomes law. Thank you.